How you doing, guys? This is Eric from RealTheWasteland.com. So I have talked, I don't want to say extensively, but mentioned a few times in some past videos and live streams about how I thought the food shortage and just general supply chain issues would have gotten a lot worse by now. And I think some of it is related to, and it doesn't seem to have really kicked in yet. And like I said, I've always said, and I think said at the time, the timelines are not only my weakest point, I tend to come a little early, but they're also just the hardest things to predict in general. And I do think part of it is related to kind of the frog in the boiling water, where if we jump, from 2 years ago to now, the way that the store shelves look, of having anything not being 100% full would seem kind of weird. But the bottom line is that there's not massive shortages yet in terms of food and things like that. And I think part of that's related to the delay that you see in terms of, like, when there's a bag of rice sitting on the shelf sometimes, or other vegetables or whatever, that might not be from the most recent harvest or whatever. I don't know what type of delay they have for different types of grains and things like that, but it's going to be probably more so than, fresh fruit, which obviously they're not from way long beforehand. So I do still think that nothing has changed in terms of these issues, but the major problems haven't shown up yet, luckily. Now, I could, if nothing happens by this time next year, or by the end of the year, and we still haven't had any major shortages, then something about the scenario I haven't actively, or accurately rather, assessed. So it'll be time at that point to definitely reassess. But as of right now, I don't think anything's changed in terms of the problems. And I think we're kind of lucky that they haven't manifested in terms of shortages yet. It gives us a lot more time to get to that level of preparedness that we want. Save up food, save up money, whatever, different things like that. So let me know what you guys think. I know we have seen shortages in different parts of the country that are different depending on where you're at. Out here, really nothing major. Even with meat, the eggs are the ones that are most noticeable, but it's manifested more in terms of price than in terms of this actual shortages. But there's definitely noticeably less eggs in the egg section, but I have never seen it completely wiped out or even close, because as we know, price tends to compensate for demand, and that shortage, when there are shortages. So if the eggs were the same price as they always are, I think they would probably be wiped out. But once they start getting harder and harder to bring to market, then the price goes up. So, there's unsurprisingly fewer buyers at $5 a dozen than there are at $1.29 a dozen. So that has at least caused there to be not as many major shortages, but we do have to deal with pretty significant price hikes. That does bring up a video that I made a while back about how price gouging can actually be helpful. Because like I said, imagine if they weren't allowed to gouge, which in this case, this isn't even considered gouging by most people, but say they weren't allowed to raise their prices, or some kind of price control, like I said, there would be no eggs. There's probably people eating a lot fewer eggs than normal because it's $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 a dozen, as opposed to anywhere from 99 cents to $1.99 or whatever for the normal ones. So it's actually made it so that there are eggs available. And now eggs specifically aren't something that you need there to be available for most people, but apply the same kind of dynamic to gasoline, or to different types of medicines, or the lumber, or whatever else, things that are much more like of a necessity, much more of an inelastic demand in certain sectors, specifically like gasoline. If you try to say that there can't be any price raises in gasoline at the same time that there's shortages, people are going to be like, well, I might as well still do that road trip then, instead of flying, when normally they would just cut back on certain activities that weren't really necessary, allowing there to be gas still available, albeit at a higher price, but still available for stuff like trucking, like emergency services, like people who just literally have to commute to work because they're in a kind of obscure rural area and there's no other, public transportation, or bicycling's not an option, things like that. But when the price controls kick in, which is something that I do think we're absolutely going to see more and more going forward over the next 1, 2, 5, 10 years or whatever, that it's going to cause more shortages. So I think the price controls will probably be more responsible for massive shortages than, strictly speaking, supply chain issues when the prices can adjust. I think so far that's probably the biggest factor, is that the price increases are allowing the demand to adjust. And when they try to control the price, that's going to change. Now, if there's a massive supply choke, then it won't matter on anything. Like if the eggs literally almost disappeared, it wouldn't matter what the price is. There still wouldn't be enough of them available to fit the demand. So that is possible. I expected that to happen more so with things like wheat and rice and things that staple, specifically the wheat. But I haven't even noticed a massive increase in prices in those items. Not even as much as we would see or have seen in the eggs. But I do think it's still coming. I think I'm just, as usual, not have a good grasp of how long these things take. Sometimes when you identify a problem, it can seem really imminent, when you know it's there, when it's not always the case in terms of how these things manifest, especially when most people aren't worried about it. Like I've said, and like a lot of these prepping channels have said, the panic a lot of times is what's going to cause some of these major problems. And when that hits, it can turn on a dime. If there is actually any sort of public perception of there being shortages in the future, that will push it back and there will be shortages much sooner as people try to prepare for it. But like we see with the hurricanes and other disasters, that really only happens last minute once it's kind of in the public zeitgeist, once it goes out on the news. Oh my God, there's a hurricane coming, when, even though these people have lived in Florida for decades and hurricanes happen every year, they still every time wait for the news to tell them. So when they start showing up and then it becomes in the public eye, then that's when the massive shortage is going to hit, because not only will we have supply chain shortages from all the stuff that's going on overseas and just all the other nonsense going on in the world, then we'll have an increased demand at the same time due to fear, due to panic, whatever, and that'll really cause it to kick in massively. So I think it's a blessing in the short term that we can still have access to all the stuff at relatively reasonable prices, comparatively speaking. But I can't imagine how we're not going to see major issues over the next year or so. But like I said, if we get to 2024 without having any significant shortages or massive price increases, then I was at least somewhat wrong about what the situation is. Or something, drastically could have changed in the meantime, but it would mean that something is not as I suspected it is. So we'll reevaluate at the time. But let me know what you guys think, if you think that we might be getting lucky and coasting through the worst of this, or if it's just hasn't even begun yet. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.